All right, so we're talking about state and props. We're going to answer some questions about these. We've got a beer garden app all ready for some scaffolding. So I'm going to kick this off with an npm start. Yes. All right, and on 3003, we have a React any day now app. So what we're trying to make is this. Did anybody read the guide on the React website that was about like how to think in React? Cool. That's a super good reading. Highly recommend it. But I'm going to go through the approach that they have you use on there, and hopefully that ends up being a cool thing you can put in the bag of tricks, because it helps with the state and prop stuff a lot too. And one of the first things that I'll do when I'm going through a new React app is I just delete a bunch of shit, because you get some boilerplate that you don't actually need. So I'm going to keep that. I'm going to get rid of this. 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 So then I will take that out and take that out and take that out. I do this with basically every like frameworks generators. They generate a lot of stuff that's like showing you how stuff is put together that isn't actually important. And over here, let's get rid of the logo. And then I'll get rid of all of this, and we'll just make sure that everything's still wired up.
I have a quick question.
Yep, hit me.
What is that reading called?
That reading, how to think in React. It's something like that. Thinking in React, maybe.
Okay.
Okay, I've got that. And why is the hot reload going so slow? Cool. All right, we're in business. So the main takeaway from the Thinking in React reading is that where you should start when you're trying to build out a component hierarchy like this, it's okay to sketch these kinds of things out, but if you try to make it this way from the start, it's actually a lot harder than it is just hard coding it in place and then progressively breaking that into some components. So I have a beer list with some beers in them. So what we can do is in the JSX, we can just hard code all of that stuff out as HTML. So I'm going to make something with the class name beer list. And it's going to have an unordered list inside it, and it's going to have list items, and this is going to be called a beer listing, and maybe it has something like a beer name and then an image in it. So grab the URL for that. Give it alt text. And then we can just make a couple of those. So this one will be called Francis. Shit, I've already forgot how it's pronounced. Franciscaner. It's one of my favorites.
Any reason you put those in divs inside of the list items?
Yes, there's a very good reason for that. And I'll tell you in just a sec. Franciscaner. There we go. This is one of my favorite beers. And okay, so I have a couple listings here. Question was, why am I putting them in divs instead of like putting them in the LIs directly? For example, for this one, like why wouldn't I just do something like that? And the rationale on this is that when you're doing listings like this, it's really handy to be able to either put it in a list or not. So for example, if I'm getting back from the API, I get back a list of beers, I want to be able to pass that array into a beer list and have it make a bunch of beer items for me, just like we have here. But it's also possible that I might want to get back a single beer and maybe like, I don't know, feature it or something. Like, it's reasonable that I might want to reuse that beer listing component outside of a list of them. And so if that's an LI as like the top level element for that, LIs have to be inside lists. And so by putting it in a div, we get a little bit more flexibility with the component. Super sharp question. Okay, so I should be able to see. I don't know why this is not hot reloading. Everything's running fucking slow. So I should be able to see that listing of 3 beers. My recommendation when you're doing your own projects, when you're at work, any of these kinds of things, is start here. Start by just hard coding some data like this. Now we start breaking this into components, and it gets a lot easier to figure out like where the state and props and stuff go. So, for example, I got to take all these things that I hard coded and somehow get them into state. So step 1 of that is turning this functional component into a class component because it's going to have state now. So I want you to think about what the steps for that would be. What are the steps that I have to follow to turn a functional component into a class component? Think to yourself for a sec. I'm going to call on someone. If I want to turn this into a class component, what are the steps? Rachel, what should I do?
You should extend component.
Okay.
Call it a class.
Yeah, should probably call it a class. Extends component. Okay.
And then you also have to add that at the top.
Yeah. Okay. What else?
You need a render.
Yep, but before that, why is my text editor mad at me right now? What's wrong on this line?
You don't need the parentheses.
Cool. All right, so I need a render method. Now what?
The body of the function has to be inside the render.
Cool. So I move that in here. All right, and I've got a class component. So going back and forth between functional and class components, that's like bread and butter work for a React dev. All right, so this is a good opportunity to talk about state a little bit. So what we're going to do to make state happen is something like this, where we can have the name of the beer, we can have an image URL, so I can grab that, throw it there, and then I need that for Franciscaner also. Okay, so I've got this stuff in state, and almost 100% of the time, this is exactly how I'm going to do it. Now, you've probably also seen that constructor syntax. Brad, what would the syntax for doing this in the constructor look like?
Brad, you're not unmuted. I think you think we can hear you, but we can't.
Sorry. Gotta press spacebar. So you have to do constructor. You just call constructor up at the top.
Okay.
And then you have to put state inside of that, but before that you have to call super. Both that.
So I can put that in here, and then what else do I have to do?
I believe you have to do this dot state.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, just like this. Cool. So let's talk about this super thing a little bit. This is going to call back to some of the Rails or some of the like Mod 1 Ruby stuff. So think about what's happening, like specifically on line 4 here, class app extends component. If that's all you knew about this, what can you infer from class app extends component? I'll take a volunteer.
Component has inherited some methods from, app has inherited
Yes.
some methods from component.
Yes. So app has inherited some methods from component. One other thing, that's half of it. It's also inherited what? State. Yes. Whatever the state of that component class is, it gets that also. I don't think that's hyper relevant in this case, but anytime that you're doing inheritance with any like classical kind of thing, we're talking about getting both of those from another class. So at a minimum, we know that we have our app class and it's inheriting from this component class. Can anybody think of some methods that might be on that component class that we totally use?
I think super render.
Render. What did you say, Mike?
Isn't super one?
Super isn't quite one of them. Super is part of the class syntax, but you're in the ballpark.
Lifecycle methods?
All the lifecycle methods, of which render is one. Render is a lifecycle method. So like component did mount, all those kinds of things. Those are methods that are defined up here, and then when we write them in our app component, we're overriding them. We're saying instead of whatever the default behavior for this is, I want to do my own behavior for component did mount or something like that. So since these are classes, they have constructors. And just to make sure that we've got this glued together, what were constructors called in Ruby?
Initialize?
Initialize. Exact same thing. Constructor is the more common word. It's the more academic term for it. But initialize describes what it's doing. So you've got some way to initialize an instance of the class. So app has one called constructor. But just like initialize, every class has a constructor. So I mentioned that when we do something like a lifecycle method, we're overriding what it is on the parent class. But what if we need to access whatever the parent instance was? Like, for example, I want to do whatever the thing was doing in component did mount and add this. You need some way to like access whatever the parent's version of that was. Same thing with constructors. When you're making a new instance of app, you're also making a new instance of component. So what if I need to do some of the things from the component's constructor? That's what super is. So when I call super inside of this app component on line 6, that's the constructor method for component. And since when we make a new instance of app, we're also making a new instance of component, that's why JavaScript barfs at you if you don't call super and you start using this and you start doing any of that kind of stuff. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Before we can finish making this, we need to also make this. That's what super is doing. Cool. Give me some questions about super.
Is it not as common to see it anymore?
Yes, for a couple reasons. One is this approach to setting state in React, unnecessary. We can do it the way that we did it before and not have to use constructors or super. There are no reasons for the rest of this program you have to use constructors. And the second reason is that React in general is moving away from classes entirely. Classes were like the worst thing to ever get added to JavaScript. It was kind of a mistake to do as much shit in React with classes as they have. And so I'm sure you've heard of hooks. That's an attempt to kill off classes entirely. But like an intermediary step is like not worrying about the constructor because it causes more harm than good. Very good question. What else?
Yeah, I was wondering if I could add on to that. I've actually found that using functional components in general are a lot easier
Yep.
to do than with classes.
Yep.
And stuff like that.
Correct.
So, is it a dumb, like, I know since the app is like the main component is going to have probably the most state and all that other stuff, would it still be reasonable to use the class constructor, or should you just kind of like shoot for functional all the way?
So functional should be your default because it's just easier. There's not as much magic happening. It's very easy to debug. They're easier to test. But even in a class-based component like this, where we need to like keep track of our state, you still don't need to do that in a constructor. We can do it just like we're doing here and get away from the messiness of constructors and super and all of that. So without hooks, we still need to use class components for state, but we can handle it this way instead. It's a little bit easier. Does that answer your question, Brad?
Yeah, it does actually. That does a really good job. Also, I have one other small question.
Yeah.
This is something. Could you show us more like how to test this stuff? Because I've been trying to like do the old-fashioned console.log,
Mm-hmm.
but I struggle. And like I don't know where to put it to make things show up and whatnot. So it's like just testing every little step to make sure we get everything right. If that would be okay.
Sure. So the tool for doing that is baked into Create React App. It's called Jest. I don't want to talk about it today, but let's get a couple more people through the code challenge, and I've been rocking out on Jest a little bit, so I'd love to talk more about it. Cool. More questions about constructors, super, keeping track of state?
Yeah. So like, for instance, we started this component at the functional one because it was just kind of returning like our list of beers.
Correct.
And so if something has like a lot of different functionality, that's when we tend to turn it to a class, correct? Like for instance, I imagine now we are probably going to take like what's in the return and break that out into like a return beer function or something.
Yep. But it's not a lot of functionality. It's literally just, does it keep track of its own state? That's the only reason that something needs to be a class. It can have all kinds of cool methods on it. It can take in all kinds of cool methods as props. It can do lots of things. If it's not keeping track of its own state, it can still be a functional component.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
What else?
Maybe we'll get to this, but I'm still kind of having a hard time conceptualizing when something needs state.
Sure. So let's rewind a little bit and talk more about what that word means. Okay, so I've got a light bulb. So maybe there's a class called light bulb, and then I make an instance of it called my light bulb. So this is the blueprint. I've got my light bulb. A light bulb can be on or off. It's not a different instance. It's still the same thing. Any reference to light bulb is still pointing to the same thing, but that light bulb can be in two different states, on or off. So when we're talking about state, that's just broadly what we're talking about. In terms of React, what's the state in this beer garden app?
All the beers.
All the beers. So it could have no beers. It could have just Franziskaner. It could have Franziskaner and Coors Light. It could have Franziskaner, Coors Light, and 500 other things. Those are different states that this app can be in. It doesn't change any behaviors that it has. It's still listing them and showing them and whatever else, but those are different states of the app. So as far as whether or not a component is stateful, so all right, well the app is keeping track of the beers. What about the beer list or the individual beers? So if it's just showing them, probably not state that's any different than the beer list in the app. If this beer component can be active or it can be deprecated. Now that beer component has two different states. If we have a selected beer, that's the beer list is probably the thing that's keeping track of that, because it knows about all of its children and it goes, cool, you've selected the fourth one. That's the currently active beer. Now beer list has state. But that's kind of what we're talking about. is the light bulb on or off? And where does that need to be tracked? You can push all state in the entire application all the way up. But now your app is keeping track of, cool, which of these beers are disabled? Which beer is currently selected? You can keep pushing all of that up until it's all in app. But now app is keeping track of a lot of shit that frankly isn't its business. And it reduces some of the reusability on this beer list. Maybe I want to take that beer list component and put it in a completely different app, but now it can't keep track of its own state. So, so Rachel, explain that back to me. There was a lot of like rambling stuff.
What I got out of that is that it kind of depends on what each component needs to keep track of. If the beers, if nothing is really happening on the beer level besides them being shown, then they don't really need state.
Correct.
But if, for example, in the list it shows, like you said, which one is selected or no longer available, then the list would need state to be able to show those changes.
Eloquently put. Well done, Rachel. More questions about state, constructors, super, anything like that?
Can I also just like kind of talk through how I'm like interpreting the when you would need state or need to turn a function into a class or just leave it as a function? So like in this instance, with a beard list and then like an active beard car, we're gonna want possibly the app, main app, and then also the main container both having state, whereas like the sphere on the right of the image, the active car there, like the component for the active beard car doesn't need state because it's just hosting the beer object or the beer information, whereas the beer list, which is like changing maybe possibly,
Yes.
that's why it will need, because you can add it or subtract it, and same with the app. That's why those two would need it, whereas like the beer list container and then the active beer card wouldn't necessarily be state.
You nailed it.
Okay.
Beautiful. That's exactly what's happening there. Am I in charge of keeping track of my own state, or does somebody else do that and just tell me? Cool. More questions?
You might have already addressed it. I'm sorry if I missed it. But with the state coming out of the constructor, why now can you do that?
Sure. So, great question, Miwa. So, if I go back to how I was doing this before, these actually say the same things. So in the constructor, I'm saying, whatever my instance property of state is, set it equal to this object. That's also what this says. So it's kind of like having that at in Ruby. If we're doing it outside of a function like a constructor, that's kind of implied. There's nothing else it could be other than this.state. Does that answer your question, Miwa?
I mean, sort of. I just don't understand why they had it to begin with.
Sure. So you have to keep in mind that React is like 5-ish years old at this point. Like the class syntax like was not as robust as it is now 5 years ago. And so there were some of those things that you had to do in the constructor that you just don't anymore. Like you guys are, like the stuff we're doing in Mod 4, this is kind of like bleeding edge web stuff. Even like when we're talking about hooks, hooks were just somebody's like shower thought like less than a year ago. And now they're like the way that React is done. And so when you see tutorials that are leaning heavily on the constructor, or everybody's telling you, no, fuck this, you should just be doing functional components and hooks. Welcome to Bleeding Edge. That's what this sort of looks like. more questions about constructor, state, super?
Well, the question I have about hooks is like, we just got like a tiny little preview of it,
Mhm.
and it seems like for every element of what would have been state in another context, you have to like declare it on a separate line
Yep,
to say like what the current value is, and then like how to change that value.
correct.
You know, are people thinking of other ways to like manage that like will save like lines of code or something?
Kind of. Like, I'm not super pumped about hooks. I love that like React is getting away from classes, but like I feel like that hooks are kind of a gross solution to that problem, and create a bunch of ones on their own. Namely, exactly what you're talking about. You get these really noisy statements all over your functional components now. So there are other ways to handle that. Like every other front-end framework handles that, I think, a lot more elegantly. Another solution to that is doing all of that through Redux, having something Redux or something like it managing all the state for the entire application, and so you wouldn't necessarily need to use those things the same way that you do now. But I think that's a dumb solution also.
Okay.
But yeah, it's probably the best that we could have done given what React is, but and it is an improvement overall, but it doesn't come without its own trade-offs.
Thank you.
More questions? Cool, onward. So we've talked about that. All right, so let's keep trying to make this more dynamic. So I have all this stuff hard-coded right now. But really, what I want is like a list of beer items. So maybe I make something here that's like beers and I make this an arrow function that takes this.state.beers and maps over it. And for each beer in that array, I want to return some JSX. So it'll be actually this exact thing. And this is going to be dynamic now. So this will be beer.name. This is going to be beer.image URL. And then you can make this beer.name also. So, oops. There we go. All right, so I have turned my array of beer objects into an array of beer list items. Now what I can do is take all these hard-coded list items that I have and use that list that I just made. And it's going to be mad at me because of what thing that's on our list of questions. What else do I need? The key. Cool. What is a key? A key. I'm speaking Spanish. I'm glad I got a laugh from someone.
Like a value that React is looking for in order to keep track of all the like, elements it's adding.
Literally couldn't put it better myself. When we were having lists of things, React is trying to stay as efficient as possible And so it needs to know what needs to get re-rendered, what needs to get taken out of the DOM, all that kind of stuff. And it does that with some uniquely identifying thing. And so most commonly you do that with some kind of ID. If your names are unique, you could use those. It just needs to be something that you're confident isn't going to happen more than once in the list.
So I have a question. So
Yeah.
in this case, when you're kind of returning this LI and you're adding a key to it,
Uh-huh.
React, like when it throws the error in the browser,
Mhm.
like, hey, there's no key here, what's going on?
Mhm.
Is it looking at like the top level container of what you're returning? For instance, you added the key to the LI.
Yes.
If you had added the key to the div, like on line 5,
Mhm.
would it still yell at you? Like,
Yes, because it's whatever the top element of the thing that's in the array of JSX elements. That's the thing that has to have the key.
okay, cool. Then.
Other questions about this?
Are keys like specifically for things that are like a list item?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, it's anytime you're making a list. You don't need to put them on every element or anything. Only things that you're going to iterate over like you are here. What else? Cool. So if I did this, go ahead.
Is the key is just like an index thing? Like,
Yes.
Because we have the array, we want to know the number to keep track.
Yes. Although, a thing you should be careful of is we can actually access the index here like that. If we just try to get a second argument out of that, and then you could just make that the key. Don't do that. Like, React gets mad if you try to do that. Like, there's some other frameworks that won't let you do it at all. Because you're basically removing the efficiency. Like if you re-rendered these in a different order, they'd all have different keys now, and they're not supposed to. Like if you reversed the list, like one of the ways that it's able to do that so efficiently is that they all have those unique IDs, and they put the unique IDs in a different order and then render them that way. The indexes don't work for that. But it kind of works the same way. Great question. Other questions?
So if you were fetching from a back end, you would hopefully be using that ID.
Yes, exactly. What else? All right, onward. So this should work. Let's see that it does. Don't know what is up with my local here.
Your IDs are the same, I think. I don't know if that'll throw an error or not.
Yeah, it might. Why, yes, they are. So let's examine this. Cool, nothing's making it in. All right, all right. So I'm getting the beers. Ah, I see. So this is a mistake that you are going to make too. The mistake is on line 6. Can anybody tell me what it is?
Missing a return.
Missing a return. Thank you very much. That's an easy way to lose half an hour on a code challenge.
Yep, I did that.
Every time you do something like that, that's the reason that I was able to find that quickly is I've lost an hour or two in my life also to something like that. All right, and then they're showing up in the list. Awesome. So next step in this is we go, okay, well this right here that's kind of like a component, is it not? And so we figure out a way that we can split just this part of it out into its own component. The overall philosophy we're doing here is referred to as red-green refactor. So we're getting it working by hard coding everything. And then, so that takes it from red to green. It wasn't working, now it's working. The refactoring part is how do I keep it working, doing the exact same thing while I make the code better. This is a time-honored like skill in programming. Keeping something working is so much easier than getting something working. So if we do this right, nothing changes in the app. And the second that something stops working, we know exactly what it was that caused that. All right, so I'm going to make a new component. So I'll call this beerlisting.js. And then one of the things that I'll do when I'm doing this is I'll just copy paste the entire component in like that, and then just delete the stuff that I don't need. So beer listing is not going to have any state. It's not going to have any of this. It will have that. We're going to make it a functional component, so we don't need the render. You can change the class word to function. You can kill off all of that. We should name it correctly. Kill off the style sheet. And then we can replace all of this with all of this. And we've got a beer listing. Now, kill that off too. Make that happier.
You're exporting that.
Ah, thank you. Okay, so now let's get into some props. So, a couple of different ways we could handle this. Give me some ideas for how I handle the props that I'm going to get in this component.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Like, how it's currently declared, because I remember like the ES5 versus ES6 syntax matters in terms of making sure this is maintained as it passed. Do we have to declare this function with the ES6 stuff, or that doesn't matter, or it only matters when it's in the same?
But,
you have an
so keeping that this context consistent is like why we use arrow functions so much, especially in React. But, and this is important, in a functional component, you don't use the this keyword. This does not happen in functional components. Only class components, only class components. This classes, and that's in every language. You can do the this keyword in a function. There's like almost no good reason to. This is hand in hand with classes and objects, intensely related to that. So if we're not doing classes, know this. And that is like a simple heuristic that you can use when you're writing React components that will take you a long way. There's no reason that this keyword needs to be anywhere in this component.
Okay, cool. And then I have another question.
Yeah.
Like, what was the rationale again? Like, why did you not want to make this beer listing function just one of the functions within the app JS? Like, why make
Cool.
it its functional element?
Sure. So now I can use this independently of the app. Because if I make it just a function that's in this, now if I want to use that piece of it, I have to, it's that thing that's like, all I wanted was a banana, and I got the banana, the gorilla, and the whole goddamn jungle. By putting it into its own component, now I can do things like use it separately, like I'm using it here. I could use it in a completely different app if I wanted to.
Okay, so it helps prevent you from like having to like prop drill and that's not necessary?
It's less that and more I can use that part of the app independently from using the app itself. Because this use of the beer listing right here, that's one way I could use it, but it's not the only conceivable way that I might use it. Think about this also. I can write a test for this where I go, cool, if I give the beer listing some props, it shows these things. If it's just some part of app, now I have to render all of app to do any of that.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so give me some ideas for how I can actually use the props in this.
You have to pass in the props down.
Yep. So I can do something like that and change that to props. And we're good to go. Now, this is how we do it in a functional component. In a class component, let's say I just make a copy of this. I classify it. Extends component render okay, now it's a class component. What do I need to change to make this work? One thing. Got to add this to the props. These two versions of the beer listing component are identical.
So on the class version, though, you're never calling in props into the like you are into the function.
Correct.
Okay.
And the reason why, if I was doing the constructor, that's what's getting past the props.
Oh.
And then I go this dot props equals props. Any guesses why, if I just delete all of this, it still works? We talked about it.
Because if the class inherits those things.
Yes! Because that's what's happening in the constructor of the component class. It's taking in those props and just setting them on the thing. So if I'm not overriding that, I get the default behavior, which is fine, and it's why I have that. Love it when a plan comes together.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Could you like point to in what beer listing is beer listing going to be like the main like component that's housing all the beers individually, like it's the main container? Okay. So in that case, we would want it to have state possibly because we want to be able to.
Well, beer listing is just this part right here. If we were going to keep going, we'd probably have a beer list component. But I think I know where your question is going. They only need state if they were doing something like, oh, well, there's two states for a beer listing component, activated, not activated. We're keeping track of selected beers in the beer list. Those might be reasons to put state on those. But until you have those, just make them functions. Because we've seen how easy it is to go back and forth between functions and classes. It takes literally seconds. So make it a function until you have a reason not to make it a function. All right, one last thing to bring this all around. So to use this beer listing component, I import it in like that. And then use it like this, and I can say something like, well, let's take a look at how I did it here. So this is taking in props, and it's looking for a name and an image URL. So the way that I have it now is beer listing, name is beer.name and image URL equals beer.image URL. And now I can delete all of that.
Don't you need to call it, like whenever you import it, don't you need to call it beer listing on top as well?
No, because, hang on, save. There we go. So when I do something like this, where I have name, image URL, that's what the beer listing component is going to refer to those as. The word beer doesn't show up anywhere in there. So the left side of this is what the component's going to call it. The right side of this is what I'm calling it. So beer listing thinks it's name. Where I am in this function right now calls it beer.name. I'm linking those together, but it doesn't need to be called beer.name in here. Another thing that's worth underscoring is I write this part of it exactly the same whether it's a functional component or a class component. Doesn't make any difference. It's just props either way. Who gives a shit? So I can wipe out the class version of this. Also, I'm sure Damon showed you this at some point. Since I'm saying props.name, props.image URL, props.name, I can also destructure that out just because, I mean, it's a regular function. I could do that with anything. So I can destructure those, and now I don't even need to put that in there. That's Foxy. And then, what is it? What's it upset about me here? Beer listing is not defined. That's not true. Oh.
Yeah. Just that's what I was referring to.
Ah. Thanks, George. You got it. You know what's up. All right, now that goes away. And if I restart this, I should have the exact same thing that I had 45 minutes ago. And to do. Cool. Any last questions?
I have one, and I think it has more to do with syntax, like ES6 syntax than anything else.
Okay.
And that's, sometimes I seem to get confused when to throw const in front of function. And I think the answer to that is whether or not you want the function to run on the load of the render or not, but I'm not sure.
So inside of a class, there's no var const let, like that wouldn't make any sense. Inside of the class, it's a specific syntax. In this though, now we're in a function body, completely different. So I would totally do some function here. That would make sense. But the body of a function and the body of a class are completely different. You can't just put arbitrary states in the body of a class, statements in the body of a class, but you totally can in a function. Cool. Time for 2 more. Browserify React. Okay, cool. Let's say I want to put this up on Firebase. So this is crazy easy. All you have to do, npm run build. And so what this is going to do is it's going to take all these like cool React components that we've made, and it's going to jam them into an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file, so that we can actually deploy this stuff. So all of those just got put into this build folder And so if I look inside build, hey, there's an index.html file. There's JavaScript files. There's images. There's stuff that like we can just statically deploy. And so if I do something like Firebase new, or shit, I forget what it's called. Firebase init. And I want to host this. I want to create a new project. It's going to be called Beer Garden Lesson. That's fine. It's going to make that for me. And one of the things it's going to ask me is, cool, which folder in this project has all your static assets in it? And we're going to make it that build folder. So it's doing all the Google provisioning kind of stuff. What's your public directory? So our public directory is build. Is it a single page app? Yes, it is, actually. And do I want to overwrite the index.html? Nope, I just built it, it's fine. Cool, so we did all that. I Firebase deploy. And that is live on the internet now.
Does that run or npm run build work for libraries as well?
Pew, pew,
Or is
pew.
it just React?
That's part of Create React App.
Okay.
Browserifying just random JavaScript shit, that's a different lesson.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, any of you can hit that, and there's our React app. Looking cool.
Right.
Hmm?
I said you recorded this lesson, right?
Yes, I did. All right, and I got to hop into the next one now, but thank you all so much. Good luck in your code challenges.
Thank you.